You have to teach me how to say goddamn politics in French.
Hang on, is that what the GD is for? Oh, that's really good. I just thought it was your initials. I did not realize that that was the pun.
I'm not that self-centered.
I thought that was it, but I didn't want to assume. How would you put that in French, Philippe? Est-il politique?
How vulgar do you want to go? Because we could go like deeply, because our swear words in Quebec are all like Catholic words, right? So it depends how deep you want to go. If you want to say, oh, maudite politique, like damn politics, but you could go into like crise de tabarnak de merde de politique. So that's not recorded, right?
That is recorded. That is recorded.
Well, that's fine.
Hello and welcome to the GD Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk. At the start of the year, it looked like Canada was getting ready to repeat a political story we've seen play out across the globe. After decades-high levels of inflation, amid a shortage of affordable housing, and a backlash to liberal immigration policies, the unpopular incumbent, the Liberals, seemed destined for electoral defeat. But then two things happened. On January 6th, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, boasting a mere 22% approval rating, announced he would resign. And 2 weeks later, President Trump took office, talking about turning Canada into America's 51st state and threatening many and then levying some new tariffs on Canada. Since inaugurated, Canadian Conservatives have gone from a 23-point lead in the polls on average to a 4-point deficit today. Now, newly selected Liberal Prime Minister Mark Carney is testing whether that dynamic can last another month. This past Sunday, he called for a snap election to be held on April 28th. I could think of no one better to talk about all of this than the election forecasters of Canada. Carrying Canada's 538 mantle, we have Philippe Fournier, editor-in-chief of 338 Canada. Welcome to the podcast, Philippe.
Hello, Galen.
Also here with us is Eric Grenier, author of The Writ. Welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here.
You both also co-host a podcast that is in English called The Numbers and in French, Les Chiffres. I'm curious, is this a bilingual podcast? Like, does one of you speak in English and the other replies in French?
Well, we're mandated by the government to translate for every listener, both English and French. No, we do some episodes in English. Our podcast is mostly the English language podcast, The Numbers. And then once in a while, we also have a French language episode or two for Les Chiffres.
Although that's a pretty good idea. We should do a completely bilingual podcast, Eric. Okay, thank you, Galen. We'll take that up.
Yeah, I mean, my high school French only will get me so far in that circumstance. I'm curious, though, how much of the campaign happens in French versus English, and how many of the 40 million Canadians are actually bilingual?
About 10 million Canadians can speak French. And of course, about 80% of Canadians living in the province of Quebec have French as their mother tongue. And we have about, 250,000 in New Brunswick, 500,000 in Ontario that speak French. So there are francophones throughout the country, but it's mostly Quebec, Ontario, and New Brunswick that have francophones. So I think it's like 24% of the population that speak French.
Yeah, just in terms of the campaign, like each of our campaign stops, the leaders tend to do both English and French. Sometimes they do the exact same thing in English and French, and they take questions from journalists in English and French. Among those who are bilingual, and all of our leaders at least speak a little bit of both languages.
Otherwise, there's mayhem. And when a leader snubs a French question, you hear it in the media. It's a very sensitive issue, language, and so they are very careful about making sure that both languages are covered.
It's hard to imagine from an American perspective where our campaigns are waged decidedly in one language, although you do get every now and again the funny moment where somebody tries to campaign in Spanish, and sometimes it works and sometimes it really doesn't work. Okay, let's talk about those politics. How much of the shift in the polls, something like a 27-point shift in the span of a couple months, is attributable to Justin Trudeau stepping aside versus the dynamics that President Trump has created with his talk of annexing Canada and the tariffs he's levied?
It's hard to separate them out. We haven't really seen some specific polling that would tell us like why Canadians are moving their vote around. I do think that Justin Trudeau's resignation did have a big impact because there were a lot of people who didn't like him anymore and they were tired of Justin Trudeau. And they might have been willing to vote for the Liberal Party, but they weren't willing to vote for it if Trudeau was the leader. So I think his resignation was the first act that moved the polls a little bit. And then you did have Donald Trump, and he has really... I don't think Americans, well, maybe they might have seen it on like CNN and stuff, but I don't think they can fully appreciate just how much of an impact it's had here in Canada. That, the 51st state stuff, we don't take that as a joke.
No.
That's at first it was, kind of a stupid joke. And eventually it started to become pretty insulting. And I think we've seen in Canada just a huge shift in public opinion on anything. Like we're now booing the anthem at hockey games, and travel to the United States has plummeted. And you go to stores in Canada, and it says, like all the grocery store has made sure there's little signs that say that the product was grown in Canada so that people can buy Canadian products. So that has really changed people's views on politics. And I think it changed what Canadians were looking for in terms of a government and a prime minister. And then in comes Mark Carney, kind of a dull technocrat. And in the context of threats from the United States, you have a volatile president there. The dull technocrat suddenly seems a lot more attractive to a lot of voters than it would have been the case had he become prime minister last fall, when Donald Trump and threats and stuff weren't really a factor yet.
I would say also when the daily threats, because they are threats, right? I've heard some Americans say, "Oh no, he's just joking around. It's not that serious." No. It's really pissing people off here, and it's not funny anymore. It hasn't been funny for a while, and initial reaction when Donald Trump started his daily threats. Annexation and 51st state and tariffs, the Liberal government basically said, okay, we're not going to stand for this. Whereas the Conservatives' first reaction, they changed since, but the first reaction was, oh, well, this is obviously because of the Liberals. They made us weak. And so, and we saw the numbers move right away. Like it was late January. There were initial signs of polling that showed that the Liberals were recovering, but the big movement happened after that. And then I think a lot of Canadians, the thing is Canadians are not as partisan as US voters, right? Numbers can move a lot from one election cycle to another. And so many voters are swing voters, and they were like lending their vote to the Conservatives because they want to change. And now they see, well, change can happen without changing the party. So that's one way to see it too.
I have a lot of questions about Canadian politics. The more research I did, the more interesting I found Canadian politics. And I think, as many of you probably know, Americans don't pay nearly as much attention to foreign countries' politics as they pay attention to our politics. But we gotta talk about that elephant in the room, which is like our president keeps talking about annexing your country. And you said that Canadians are taking it seriously. The polling shows that. I found a Leger poll that showed that 63% of Canadians say that Trump's expressed interest to make Canada the 51st American state must be taken very seriously. And a slim majority of respondents to the survey now say they're willing to personally defend Canada from a military threat. Right. You get the sense that on this side of the border, it feels, while strange, much more like a joke than your polling suggests. Now, is that expressive responding like, we're in this patriotic moment, so that's what we're saying? Or do you actually think that nearly 2/3 of Canadians think that America is preparing to take your country using military force?
Well, the thing is, it's not as if, we follow your politics. It's not as if it's been very predictable lately. And considering the chaos seems to be the new normal, we don't know what's going on there. We don't know what to expect. And obviously, we don't expect bombers above our cities right away. But if there is like the threat of, and I'm using your president's words, economic force to attack us, that's a first step towards other actions, you would think. And so I have never seen this before in my life, going to the grocery store and people looking at products, made in the USA, no thank you. And it's happening throughout the country. And you will have a lot of also snowbirds canceling their trips to the United States. Lots of vacation plans into Vermont, to New Hampshire, to Washington State are getting canceled because we don't want any part of this. So, yeah, I don't know how it will end, but I know it didn't start well.
No. I mean, we're not digging trenches in our backyards like that. We're not there yet. I think it's more that we, as Philippe said, I think it's that we don't really know what it's going to be, right? Trump keeps saying it, and he doesn't stop saying it. And he has said more or less that he would like to make sure that our economy is not good enough that we would want to join the United States. So I think we see it more as an actor in the States who is unpredictable, who wants to do this, might think that he can, even if we say no. And there's been polling on this, and 90% of Canadians would vote against joining the United States if there was a referendum. It's not something we want.
No.
And just to have this suddenly thrust upon us, I think has really shaken a lot of Canadians, their faith in the United States as a friend. And I do think it is more about feeling this sense of hurt and betrayal rather than anger and that kind of thing. I think that there's this sense that, like, well, what did we do? Why are you bothering us? We haven't done anything. We've just been here the whole time.
You're not angry. You're disappointed. That's how very Canadian of you.
Yeah, that's really what it is. We're just shaking our heads.
Which, by the way, I saw that polling as well, that 10% of Canadians would vote to join the United States in a referendum. Obviously, 90% would not. Who are those 10%?
Oh, God. Well, okay. I'll be very careful not to pass judgment, although my comment right there was judgment. You have voters in the United States, you know this, Galen, that are deeply anti-system. They go to the dark corners of the web to have these conspiracy theories, complete nonsense. We have those too. And many of those, according to the polls that we have, support President Trump. And they would love to have him as president of North America. And so but these are fringes, people on the fringes. When you get 10 to 1 on a poll, it's very difficult to find any issue that casts so much support.
While we're speaking broadly here about hypotheticals that I frankly never really thought I would be talking about, technically your head of state is King Charles III, right?
Yeah, well.
Is Trump threatening King Charles III? Like, because he also seems to be a pretty enthusiastic supporter of the British monarchy. I mean, does the UK also feel threatened by the United States' threats towards Canada? I mean, has King Charles weighed in on this? Is Canada waiting for King Charles to weigh in on this?
God.
Well, I mean, we got some great support from our king. He gave one of his valets, who's Canadian, a sword, and I think Princess Catherine, or whatever her name is now, she wore red at an event, and the king wore our Canadian medals. So yes, King Charles III is technically our head of state. No one in Canada really cares that much about that, and support for abolishing the monarchy is usually more than 50% when it's polled. It's just that no one bothers because it would cause so many problems in terms of constitutional renegotiations and all this kind of thing. Yeah. So Canadians generally don't pay too much attention to it. I did see that when Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, was asked about it, he more or less wanted to change the subject. So I don't think we're feeling lots of love from our one of our former mother countries. And I mean, you were talking at the beginning about the Francophone population. Quebecers and other French Canadians generally don't see King Charles III as a beacon of hope and their fearless leader.
Well, I can see Philippe has been shaking his head the entire time you've been talking.
I grew up in Montreal, live in Quebec. See, I mean, I'm a Quebecer, and so for me, the monarchy is just a joke. And the events of the past months has just proven it's just convention at this point. Basically, a lot of Canadians and Quebecers would be willing to abolish the monarchy here. It's just we don't know what to replace it with. And if you open constitutional negotiations, every province will come with their demands, and there's potential for chaos there. So it's like we put a lid on it and say, okay, it's the king's on our money. Officially, it's the head of state, but who cares?
Today's podcast is not brought to you by a direct-to-consumer mattress company. It's not brought to you by a hair loss or erectile dysfunction medication provider. And it's also not brought to you by a business-to-business e-commerce platform. Today's podcast is brought to you by you, the listener. I'm in the early stages of getting this podcast off the ground, and it will only succeed with your support. I want to bring you coverage that embraces curiosity, rigor, and a sense of humor. And I want to bring it to you on a regular basis with more episodes, more insight, and more laughs. I can only do that if you subscribe to and support this podcast. Go to gdpolitics.com and become a paid subscriber today. Even better, do it right now. gdpolitics.com, that's G as in gosh, D as in darn, and politics as in that hot mess. Head to gdpolitics.com to subscribe, and thank you. Let's talk about some of the nitty-gritty. Philippe, you mentioned at the top that there were plenty of swing voters who were lending their support to conservatives because Justin Trudeau was so unpopular. But when looking at the polling averages, which both of you have polling averages, by the way, is this a sort of team of rivals here? How similar are your averages? Are you competitive? Because you each have your own separate averages that you're conducting.
Yes, I will say this. I never saw, Eric started before I did. I never saw Eric as a competitor because I'm a physics teacher. I teach at my college. I see Eric as like a department colleague. We do similar things. We do things our way. And also he's a super nice guy. So I don't feel competitive, or maybe Eric does, but never told me.
No. We're best of buds.
Yeah. It's not a competitive issue here.
Good to hear. Okay, so the averages right now, and I'm just looking at the CBC News averages, which, Eric, I think you're responsible for. I'm sorry, Philippe.
How dare you? How dare you?
I'll cite your data later on. Okay, so Liberals sit at 40% in the polls today. Conservatives sit at 37%. New Democrats at 10%. Bloc Québécois at 6.5%. And it goes on down from there. When you look at those averages over time, and now I'm looking at your averages over time, Eric, it looks like a lot of the support for the Liberals has come at the expense, not as much from the Conservatives, but from the New Democrats. So I'm curious how much of this is people getting fed up with Conservatives who they see aligned with Trump versus just saying, at a moment like this, we need to be unified behind one leader as opposed to sort of fractured across several different parties.
I think that for the Conservatives, the extra little bit that was putting them in a position where they were on track to win a huge majority government, 230 seats out of the 343 we have. There was an extra bit of voters who were primarily fed up with Trudeau and wanted change. A lot of those voters have gone back to the Liberals because Mark Carney has come in, and Carney is more of a centrist leader, whereas Justin Trudeau was a bit further on to the left. But over the last few weeks, we've seen that it's the NDP vote that has just collapsed. Yeah. And the NDP, for listeners, it's a much more of a left-wing party than the Liberals. The Liberals would be a center-left. The NDP would be further to the left. Their leader, Jagmeet Singh, he's been the leader now. This will be his third campaign. He has never really taken off as a leader, and his political skills are sometimes a little bit suspect, his judgment when it comes to taking various positions. And until Trudeau resigned, the NDP, I think, was being kept afloat by the unpopularity for Justin Trudeau. But now that Trudeau's gone, a lot of NDP voters said, I don't need to hold my nose and vote for the New Democrats. I can go back to the Liberals. So we've seen this combination that there's this chunk of voters that might not have liked Poilievre's style. He's more pugnacious. He's a bit more abrasive. And they went back to the Liberals. And then you had these NDP voters from the left who didn't really like their option either, but found Trudeau unpalatable. And now they've gone over to the Liberals. So it's kind of a perfect storm, I guess, for the Liberals to get all these voters from all over the spectrum. And for the Conservatives, I was just looking at the numbers today. You have to go back 100 years. For them to have 37% and not win an election just doesn't happen.
Wow.
So it just shows how things have become really polarized in Canada, that we now are focusing on just the two parties rather than these other third parties that often take a big chunk of the vote.
And I would add, Galen, if I may, so in proportions, yes, the NDP has taken bigger of a hit. But if you look in raw numbers, I look at my averages. So early January, I had the Conservatives on average at 45. Now the average is 37. That's 8 points. The NDP was at 18. Now it's at 10. That's 8 points. So basically, the Liberals have been able to draw these swing voters from all sides. In proportions, of course, this is really hurting the NDP. You need 12 seats in the House of Commons to be an official recognized party. And right now, I just don't see how the NDP gets there unless things move. I don't know what's your upper range right now, Eric? My upper range is 12. So if everything goes well right now with these numbers, the NDP, barely makes it to 12 seats.
There's an interesting dynamic in Canada that is quite the opposite of the United States. In recent elections, we have seen Liberals get fewer votes than Conservatives, but actually more seats in Parliament. And right now, although the polling is actually pretty close between Liberals and Conservatives in terms of popular support, when that is projected to seats, according to the work that you all do, it actually doesn't look like that close of a race between Liberals and Conservatives. So I'm curious how you two would characterize the race right now. Is it a toss-up or is it truly a Liberal advantage? And where does that dynamic come from? Why do Liberals seem to have the geographic advantage when it comes to constituencies, which is the opposite of where things stand in the United States?
Well, I'd say it's similar to the 2016 presidential election. President Trump became president without winning the popular vote, right? And there's a reason for that, is that basically Democrats run up the vote in very democratic areas of the country, such as California and others. So the Conservatives in Canada in the past cycles did extremely well in the rural regions, Saskatchewan, rural Alberta, rural Ontario, and they ran up the score in those seats. If you win a seat by 5 points, or you win a seat by 50 points, that's just one seat. Whereas in the suburbs of the larger cities, in the cities too, Montreal, Vancouver, Toronto, the area, that many seat-rich region around Toronto, Liberals have been able to win those seats by reasonable margin between 5 and 15 points. And so the total was that, the Conservatives won the popular vote by a single point. It was not a landslide either. But it was 1 point ahead for the Conservatives, but their vote was all concentrated in these rural areas.
And when you ask how we would classify the election, if the election was tomorrow, I think we'd both say the Liberals are pretty heavy favorites because they have a couple point lead in the polls, and because of how their seat works out, that they could actually win a majority, which they haven't had in the last two elections. But I think it would be tough for us to say with, I think, 34 days to go in the campaign, which I know in the United States is like the final days of the campaign. Everything's settled in. In Canada, this is the beginning. We can have campaigns our campaigns generally last 5 weeks, 5 to 7 weeks. That's in the law. That's the length of a campaign. And we've seen things completely change in the last 2 weeks. So we've seen things completely change in the first 2 weeks. So while right now it would be the Liberals' favorite to win, I think both of us have 85% or 90% chance they would win the most seats of an election were held today. But in 5 weeks, I don't know. You'd have to, if we were forecasting forward, I'm sure we would say more 60-40 for the Liberals. Nothing overly confident because, as Philippe said earlier, Canadians move around when it comes to elections. We're not; these aren't elections decided over 3 or 4 points in the suburbs of Pittsburgh and Pennsylvania. These are elections where you can have literally 150 seats change hands in an election, and you can have 10 to 15% of the electorate decide to vote for a party they didn't vote for in the previous election.
Because also in our system, with winning by seats, sometimes the seat distribution with regard to votes is not linear. There is a sweet spot, we say in French, la zone payante, where at some point, if you're, let's say the Bloc Québécois in Quebec, right now it's polling at around 25%. Well, 25% is okay, but 22% could be devastating for that party. So if you just lose a little support here and there, at some point all these dominoes start to fall. And in 2011, the Bloc Québécois had 23% of the vote in the province of Quebec and was wiped off the map. There was only 4 seats left, and I think they had 50 before then. So it's not linear. So that's why the projecting seat by seat sometimes is a risky business, because if a party gets 5% more than we expect, that could be a lot of seats.
Your comment about how more Canadians are liable to change from one party to the next over the course of a campaign or from one election to the next makes me think of the British circumstance where polls are somewhat less accurate than in the United States because there aren't such entrenched voting patterns where you know a couple demographic pointers about somebody and you can more or less guess how they'll vote. So are Canadian polls less accurate than American polls?
Okay, that you put the finger right there.
Ooh, okay.
Okay, I'll say this. There are a lot of awful posters in the United States. There are some good ones, but you have a lot of noise. And I know I followed the American elections. Of course, I focus on the presidential. But thing is, there's a Darwinism in that happens in Canada, whereas bad pollsters go out of business. And so the only ones left are the ones that did okay. So in recent years, we had like a big filter out of pollsters in this country, the national ones at least. So the thing is, I think a pollster who is not very precise or accurate, United States can still get contracts because of the sheer number of people and opportunities. Whereas if you miss in Canada, your reputation will be shot and you won't get contracts. So in federally at least. Polls have been really good in the past decades. There have been, of course, a few misses, but in general, in our averages, we're right on in the last elections.
And I think one of the other factors that's different for the United States, though, is that if the polls are off by 2 points in the United States, then it means the other party got the 2 points. And so that can have a big impact on the outcome. Here, if the Conservatives are underestimated in the polls by 2 points, they'll get the 2 points, but maybe one of them comes from the Liberals, one comes from the NDP. And so it doesn't have as much of an impact on calling the election because the errors aren't all uniform across the board. And because we have very regionalized politics, if the polls miss in Alberta, which they did in the last couple elections by like 5-10 points for the Conservatives, doesn't happen in Ontario. It doesn't happen in Atlantic Canada. So in the States, you have the problem where if there's a uniform kind of miss in the polls, then the Electoral College ends up swinging really hard. Like everybody tells us, because Philippe and I both followed the U.S. election very closely, about how the polls were so wrong about how close it was. But it was just because all those states moved in the same direction. Here, you don't really have that. So you'd have some seats in some parts of the country might move overly to one side because the polls were off, but not elsewhere. So the errors aren't as consequential, I'd say, here than in the United States.
What do you see as the X factors over the coming month? I've been looking over Canadian polling over the past couple days, and one of them, according to Angus Reid, which is an organization that does sort of national nonpartisan data work, is that Conservatives seem to have the advantage on voter commitment, which is to say about 72% of people who intend to vote for the Conservatives say that they're done. They're firmly committed to that choice, whereas it's just 51% for the Liberals. Do you see that as suggesting that there's more volatility yet over the next month? And if so, is it all about Trump? Is it going to be about domestic issues too? Are the Conservatives just sitting there being like, Donald Trump, will you please just shut the up for the next 30 days so we can have a chance at winning this election?
Yeah, I think we had actually one of our conservative premiers almost literally say that to U.S. officials. I do think when you asked about the wild card, I think both Philippe and I smiled because the wild card is not Canadian. It's the American president. He has the ability to suddenly knock any news item that's happening here in Canada off the headlines, and it becomes about whatever he said. And every single time that he mentions the 51st state thing, it actually gets us. It's a news story here. It becomes a story that Trump once again said, we'd be a cherished 51st state, which also, by the way, we're a huge country. We can't be one state. You'd have to give us 10 states. We've got 10 provinces.
20
senators.
territories. Sorry.
2 senators for each of them. We want our share of the House of Representatives too. Anyway, it's so dumb. But the other, you mentioned that the hardness of that vote. Conservative base is very solid. Their floor is much higher than the Liberals, as we've seen. So I think that is one of the volatility there, that we have a lot of people moving over to the Liberals, and they might move back. They might go back to the NDP. They might go back to the Conservatives. So I think that is a reason to believe that over the next 5 weeks, there will be some kind of mushiness in the polls. But again, The real wild card in this election is the U.S. president.
Galen, the data you quoted from the Angus Reid Institute, it's interesting for sure. But the thing is, it's not new. That's the thing. Conservative voters in general are much more committed. Since the Conservative Party, the actual current Conservative Party, was formed in 2003, their first election was a loss in 2004. And then in every general election, they never got under 32% of the vote. Whereas you saw the Liberals go as low as 19% and then go as high as 39%. And then they were low in the high teens with Trudeau near Christmas. And they're back in the mid 40s right now. So this committedness, if you can use that word, is not new for the Conservatives. There's much more swing on the other side of the aisle.
That actually gets at a broader question about Canadian politics that I wanted to talk about, which, don't worry, we'll get back to Trump and how America is impacting this election. But it seems as though Canada has not seen the right being captured by far-right populist parties so far. And also that the Liberal Party still acts, as you were saying, as this sort of big tent that is more coalitional and less ideological. So, depending on the news cycle or issue prioritization, people enter the Liberal camp and they leave the Liberal camp. You said it fluctuates between the teens and the mid 40s. I mean, that's huge fluctuation. And so they have to be able to be broadly appealing to people, even if they're not hardcore ideologues. Whereas the Conservatives seem more like an ideological party, which you might compare to the Republican Party of the aughts in the United States, which was quite ideological. Today, you can call it extreme, but I don't know that there's a clear ideology. And it's maybe even easier to articulate Democrats' ideology today than Trump's ideology. We can debate that if you like, or we can save it for another day. So what do the parties represent? Why have the Conservatives not sort of been taken over by the far right? And how does the Liberal Party maintain its status as a big tent party?
Well, we do have we have a far right party in Canada called the People's Party, and it sprung up a few years ago. It didn't do much at all until the pandemic, and then they got about 5% of the vote in the 2021 election, and it was mostly motivated by anti-vaccination kind of rhetoric. That party has gone by the wayside again. It's polling now roughly around 2%. So there is at least a tiny little outlet for those kinds of voters. But I'd argue that the Conservatives I wouldn't say that they've moved that far to the right or any, but Pierre Poilievre, while he is pro-choice politician and believes in immigration that is responsible in terms of the number of people coming in, he is much more of the style, I'd say, of the American right. Much more slogans, much more about anti-establishment, nicknames, things like that. So there's some elements of it, but I think that because Canada is still a very diverse country. And, like we said, we have regionalized politics. We have, like a city like Toronto is majority, visible minority, I guess, or whatever you would call it, right? It's a diverse population. So you can't have nativist policies in Canada and go very far because you're going to lose the parts of the country that are the electorally decisive ones. And our primary system, the way that we choose leaders and the way we choose candidates, doesn't incentivize going further to the right or going further to the left in order to get the nomination or to win the party leadership. So I think there's these elements that have helped make Canada, our main parties, still largely broader tent. I would agree that the Liberals are more of a governing party in the sense of whatever people want, we'll try to be that so that we can win an election. And the Conservatives have a more solid base of positions, but I think it is just the way that our politics works that if you had a Trump style party here, I just don't think it would be very successful. And our political system penalizes parties when you can't get a lot of the vote.
Also, within the Conservatives, there are voters and also staffers and MPs that very much like Donald Trump, but they are a minority. And usually when they express their views publicly, they're quickly being told by their own party to shut the hell up. It's because it's hurting them in the broader base. The Liberals, don't forget, they have a party to their left. And so if there was, and I'm very careful here choosing my words, an extreme left element, it would not go to the Liberals. So, I mean, what would be the equivalent of let's say the anti-vaxxer, anti-pandemic measures, like far-right Trumpists? What would be the equivalent with the Liberals? It doesn't happen. There is a left party in the NDP. So that's why the broad tent that you mentioned, Galen, for me, again, I go back to Darwinism. The Liberals have been very successful since Confederation because they have been able to adjust. Some people say, oh, they don't have principles. Perhaps you could say that, but also they win elections. So you have to adjust. You have to go where the voters are. And this is what they're doing right now. The Liberal Party going more to the center, a little bit to the right, is to adjust to where many Canadian voters are today.
Today's podcast is brought to you by gdpolitics.com. As part of this new podcast, I want to hear directly from you and speak directly to you. And we're going to do that at gdpolitics.com. Using the paid subscriber chat feature, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions that I'll either answer myself or pose to my guests. You probably have questions about politics, but if you happen to be looking for a gift for your sister or want to know if your hat matches your outfit, I can help you with that too. The answers, by the way, are a subscription to GD Politics, and you have never looked better. In addition to the chat feature, if you subscribe at gdpolitics.com, you'll have access to the director's cut video version of the podcast when available. For example, you can find the video of today's podcast there without any of the swear words bleeped. Anyway, I can't do this without you. Head to gdpolitics.com and subscribe today. You mentioned that every time Trump talks about Canada as the 51st state, it knocks everything else out of the headlines. And I'm curious how much of the reaction in Canada is Trump's rhetoric about annexing Canada versus actual economic hardship felt by tariffs. Are you seeing economic consequences to the trade war already? And are people reacting negatively to that? Or is this mostly the rally around the flag effect created by these threats?
One of them is the emotional aspect, but I think that people are very concerned and they're very worried about the fate of the economy and the impact that tariffs will have. So I think that the annexation stuff, it just more gets our backs up and gets us angry and defensive. But I would say that the main issue in this election is not the fear that we'll get annexed. I don't think Canadians actually believe that'll happen. It's just that we're as Philip said, we're kind of pissed off that like you would even joke about it, right? We don't find it funny to call our prime minister a governor and all this kind of stuff. It's just insulting to everybody in Canada. But it's the threats of tariffs that are of the deepest concern. It means job losses. It would be a huge impact on the economy. We've already seen some factories lay people off, that kind of thing, in anticipation of them. That is actually the main concern. The rest is more just what is causing that emotional aspect. But everybody is pretty concerned about the impact it's going to have on our economy.
I would also add that the trade agreement that we have with the United States and Mexico has President Trump's signature on it. So he goes against his word. That means that we cannot sign another deal. Like, even if we have new negotiation, maybe President Trump wants to have new negotiation with the Canadian and Mexican governments, will he just tear it up next year? We have a deal that he himself signed. And so this mistrust is, I think, a very important part. And we saw over the last 2 months, Galen, that the threats of tariffs is, I don't want to say it's just as bad as tariffs, but it's pretty bad because the uncertainty creates very big problems for the economy on both sides of the border. But it doesn't seem to care that much about that.
Yeah. Trade practices between the United States and Canada have a long, tense history. I was reading about how in the early 19th century, lumberjacks on both sides of the border were sort of going to the other side of the border and trying to sabotage, their practices because American lumberjacks were upset about Canadians accessing the American market. And since that time, this has often been a topic of consternation between the two countries. Even, trade representative for Obama, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, wrote recently about how Canada has unfair trade practices with regards to lumber and dairy and the like, right? So this isn't a totally partisan issue when you actually talk about the technicalities of it. I know that the way that Trump talks about it is extremely unique. But has there ever been a moment like this before in Canadian politics where not just sovereignty, but trade politics, relations with the United States, becomes the central focus of your politics?
I will let Eric give you a more complete answer to this because he is the history major. But in my lifetime, I agree. I've never seen such acrimony between the two countries. But Eric, you go ahead.
I think the main example would be the 1988 election. So we had that was the election where we were debating whether we wanted to have a free trade agreement with the United States. And that was the focus of that campaign, and it was by far the decisive issue in that election. But that was more of a choice of what kind of relationship we wanted to have with the United States. There were fears that we'd get swamped by American culture, that our factories wouldn't be able to compete, and that there would be closures. And so it was more of an economic debate about what kind of role we wanted to have going forward. This is not in the same way, right? Like you mentioned, we've had the softwood lumber debates in the past. We have supply management when it comes to dairy. Like these to us are just little issues that you get dealt with in various negotiations. But the across the board tariffs that are extremely high would have such a huge knock-on effect on our economy. It would also have we should remind everyone, a huge impact on Americans who would pay a lot more because you know what? Americans pay American tariffs. We would pay Canadian tariffs. This is how it works.
Wait, what?
But
come on, really?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, we got to remind you. But so I think that's what separates that election from this one. We've also had other ones in 1911 and 1891. We had elections based on whether we wanted to have reciprocity with the United States. And in the past, in those elections, we rejected it. The parties that were proposing having free trade with the United States lost the elections because people were afraid of the U.S. economy. In 1988, the party that was suggesting having that free trade agreement, which was the Conservatives at the time, won the election, even though they won less than 50% of the vote. So there's a debate whether Canadians actually supported it or not. But it's just that this is a bit different, I think, because of the scale of it and then just the visceral emotional aspect of it, because it is tied up in all this other stuff about sovereignty.
It's also, sovereignty. And, when President Trump talks about NATO, right, stuff like this rattles not only Canadians, but all the allies. And I don't have to go through this, and I'm not a geopolitical expert, but, the only time Article 5 was called, Canada lost soldiers in Afghanistan. And suddenly he wants to tear up NATO, and all these trade agreements that we have, it adds up. All these little things adds up.
What political incentives has this all created in Canada? To quote Nate Silver, who was on this podcast recently, he said that foreign leaders' electoral incentives are to, quote, knee Trump in the balls because he is so unpopular in foreign countries. Is that what's actually happening in Canada, or is there a sense that it's a balancing act of standing up for Canada, but not attracting even more ire?
I would say that it's easier for other countries that have an ocean separating the United States. It's much easier to say, okay, well, kick him in the balls, as you say. For us, where we have so many, okay, that's true. But as many of our industries are so linked, I think de-escalation has been the priority for Canadian officials. Obviously, there's a difference between de-escalation and kissing the ring. This election, I think, is slowly turning into a leadership contest. Who will have the leadership to stand up to the American aggression, but to also make a deal? Because at the end of the day, our economy and yours depend on it. The prosperity of both countries depend on it. So, we don't have an ocean. We just have this line, which is really real, the line that separates the two countries, right?
The longest undefended land border in the world.
That's right.
Yeah, it's mostly empty land out west. I mean, it's not. We don't have most of our cities on the prairies with the U.S. border, but yeah, we actually had a recent example of this in Ontario, our biggest province, which, by the way, if it did become one of the states, I think it would be the fourth largest state, so it would have a lot of electoral college votes. So and also would vote Democratic. So beware Donald Trump. Ontario's premier, Doug Ford, who I think has made the media rounds in the United States lately, ran an election on tariffs, and he took a position of standing up to Donald Trump and using pretty strong language, and he was reelected with a pretty big majority government. So we've already seen some parties go that route, but like the extent of kicking in the balls is just. When you're actually going to be governing, it's different. Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, will call Donald Trump a fascist and that he shouldn't be allowed into the country. But he's not seen as someone who will actually form the government. So he can take that risk. But if you're actually going to become the prime minister, you're going to have to sit down in the White House at some point, and you don't want to be Zelensky, I guess.
No, exactly. Oh, and by the way, Ontario has 16 million people. It would be the fifth largest state. So that would be, 24 electoral votes?
I see you're waging your small campaign right here on the GD Politics podcast for why Trump should back down, and I appreciate it. I want to wrap up on maybe a more heartfelt note, which is that in looking at all of this polling, Americans still have a very positive view of Canada. 80 to 90% of Americans say they have a favorable view of the country. Canada no longer feels similarly. A record low number of Canadians have a positive view of the United States at just about a third. And a similar percentage of Canadians even see the United States as an enemy. So not an ally and not a neutral country, but almost a third of Canadians saying that the United States is an enemy. Again, back on the southern side of the border, the plurality of Americans say their lives would actually be better if they lived in Canada. 36% of Americans said their lives would be better if they lived in Canada instead of the United States, and 23% said it would be worse. Do you think that Trump has done irreparable damage to the relationship between Canadians and Americans? Because it seems like our love right now is going unrequited.
I wouldn't say it's irreparable, but it's a deep cut right now.
Yeah.
Disputes on lumber and dairy have been happening throughout my life and before my life. That's not new. That happens. It's okay. But the partnership on this continent has been beneficial for both countries, and being good neighbors. Canadians visiting the United States, liking Americans. I like most Americans I met in my life, right? Including you, Galen.
Oh, thank you. I like you.
But I think I don't know whether Eric agrees, but this is a deep cut, and it'll take some while to mend that.
Yeah, that's what I think is the most unfortunate thing about it. There's lots more things that are probably more unfortunate, but that this is not something that Americans actually want. Americans don't want us to be enemies. They don't want us to look at the United States in this negative way. I don't know if it'll last forever. But I do think it will have lasting impacts. And it's just, and it goes back to what I said before. I think it is more of a sense of betrayal. Not that we were predisposed to disliking Americans or not trusting the country. It's just that we did. And then all of a sudden, this is happening to us, and we don't really understand why. We don't, and I think that's what makes it hurt for a lot of Canadians. I know that Americans don't spend their days thinking about what we're thinking about, but we end up having to think a lot about what the Americans think. And so when we find out that the relationship that we've had for so long, that has been so positive, is that easily broken, I think that we're all still feeling pretty raw about it. And I think it will take a long time for things to recover, assuming that, things don't get worse in terms of tariffs and impacts on the economy and all these kinds of things. So, yeah, it's a tough time for Canadians, I think. A lot of Canadians are worried about this in a way that I don't think that they thought they would be ever in their lives.
All right. Well, we will see what happens next on the relations between Americans and Canadians. But sooner we will see the results of this upcoming election, and maybe I'll have the chance to talk to you two again. But for now, thank you so much for leaving, Eric.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Galen. So now by law, we have to redo the whole thing in French. So let's do it.
Yeah, okay, get ready.
Bonjour tout le monde.
Je suis Galen Druk.
Et voilà.
Yeah, and that's,
there you go.
That's about as far as we can go. My name is Galen Druk. I'm in the early days of getting this podcast off the ground, and I appreciate your support in any way possible. Subscribe to GD Politics wherever you get your podcasts, and if you'd be so kind to rate and review us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.